On November 25th, 1177, under the pale winter sun of the Holy Land, a dying 16-year-old boy with his hands wrapped in silk bandages sat upon a warhorse. The wind tugged at his white cloak embroidered with golden crosses, brushing against the cold silver mask that hid a face already being eaten away by leprosy. Behind the metal, beneath the rotting flesh and numbing nerves, burned a pair of eyes too steady, too fierce, too alive for a body that was slowly collapsing. This was Baldwin the Forter, King of Jerusalem, known to friend and foe alike as the Leper King, a ruler whom many whispered would not survive to adulthood. Yet this frail, fading boy was about to face the greatest Muslim army the Middle Ages had yet produced. 26,000 mounted warriors under the command of Saladin himself. To understand Montgisard, you must first imagine the hopelessness. 500 knights, a few thousand infantry, half of Jerusalem's forces scattered across distant fortresses, and bearing down upon them an ocean of steel. Mamluk cavalry trained from childhood, veteran riders hardened by endless war, and the personal guard of a man who had never known defeat. The math alone was absurd. 500 against 26,000, a 52-to-1 disadvantage. Yet history does not exist to comfort us with logic. It exists to remind us that sometimes the most fragile hands can hold up the weight of the world. Before Montgisard became legend, Jerusalem was already dying. The year 1177 marked the darkest hour of the Crusader states. For nearly 80 years, Christian fortresses had clung to their footholds in the Levant, but the tide had turned. Saladin had united Egypt and Syria, raising an army so vast and disciplined that entire cities surrendered upon hearing his name. The great castles of the Crusaders fell one after another. In Jerusalem, nobles quietly prepared ships in the harbor for flight. Treaties were drafted in secret. The wealthy hid their gold. Everyone with sense knew the kingdom had months left, perhaps only weeks. And during this looming catastrophe, Jerusalem crowned a child crippled by disease. Baldwin had contracted leprosy at an early age. By 16, he could no longer feel his left arm. His face had begun to crack and bleed. His fingers were slowly curling and stiffening. Any normal boy would have been confined to a bed, hidden from sight, pitied or ignored. But Baldwin had something leprosy could not touch, a mind as sharp as a drawn blade and a will that refused to break. He ascended the throne at 13. They called him cursed. They called him doomed. But those who looked into his eyes sensed something else, something unyielding, something terrifying in its calm. And that something was about to save a kingdom. When word reached Jerusalem that Saladin was marching north with a force larger than any he had ever commanded, panic swept the court. Advisors begged the teenage king to stay within the safety of Jerusalem's walls. They pleaded with him to let his generals lead the army. They reminded him that he could barely walk without pain. But Baldwin carried into the war council on a litter because his legs could no longer support him. Delivered a single sentence that silenced every voice in the room. I may die tomorrow or 10 years from now, but I will die as I have lived, defending this kingdom. That was the moment when the impossible began. Jerusalem scraped together 500 knights and around 3,000 infantry. 80 of those knights were Templars, warrior monks who swore never to retreat. Baldwin demanded to lead them personally when the boy king was lifted onto his horse and strapped into the saddle because his legs could no longer grip it. Many of the Templars wept openly. His silver mask gleamed in the sun like a symbol of defiance against fate itself. Look at me, Baldwin said softly. God gave me this disease so that when victory comes, no man may claim it was by human strength alone. While Jerusalem prepared for its miracle, Saladin prepared for his triumph. Confident, relaxed, certain that no one would dare meet him on open ground, he let his army spread out across miles of countryside. Foraging parties drifted away. Formations loosened. His emirs debated who would rule which parts of the conquered kingdom once Jerusalem fell. All his assumptions rested on one belief, that Baldwin would hide behind his walls like every doomed king before him. But the leper king had already begun his march. At dawn on November 25th, after a brutal forced march of 45 miles in 36 hours, after collapsing from pain more than once, Baldwin's tiny army reached the hills overlooking Saladin's scattered host. The Crusaders were exhausted. Their horses were trembling. Many knights could barely remain seated in their saddles. Yet none of that mattered when their scouts brought back the news. Saladin's forces were unprepared, unformed, and vulnerable. It was an opportunity that should not have existed in a world governed by logic. When the Crusader banners crested the ridge, Saladin was at first confused, then stunned, then enraged. "It cannot be Baldwin," he said, "not with so few men." But it was, and as the reality dawned upon him, it was already too late. Baldwin, despite every agony ripping through his failing body, raised his bandaged hand. 500 knights lowered their lances, and the impossible charge began. The moment Baldwin raised his bandaged hand, time seemed to tighten around the battlefield. The air grew still. Even the horses, exhausted from the brutal march, sensed the enormity of what was about to happen. 500 knights began to descend the ridge with their lances angled forward. No hesitation, no doubt, no fear, just the thunder of hooves rolling like approaching storm clouds. The Templars took the lead, forming a sharpened wedge at the center of the formation, their black and white banner snapping behind them. These were men who believed death in battle guaranteed paradise, men who had sworn never to retreat, men who had already accepted they would not return from this field. Behind them rode Baldwin, strapped to his saddle, his silver mask glinting under the midday sun like the face of an avenging angel. Down below, Saladin's camp was still in chaos. His scattered foragers, his relaxed cavalry, his units spread across miles of farmland, all now scrambled desperately to form ranks. But forming a line requires time. And time was the one thing Baldwin had stolen from him. By the time the Muslim commanders realized what was happening, the Crusader charge was already halfway down the slope. Dust exploded beneath the hooves of the charging knights. Sunlight flashed off hundreds of lances. A roar rolled across the field, a cry so fierce it made the air itself vibrate. Deus vult! Saladin had fought Byzantines, Turks, Kurds, Bedouins. He had seen empires rise and fall, but never, not once, had he witnessed 500 men hurl themselves directly at a mounted force that outnumbered them 50-1. His chroniclers later wrote that the Sultan, shocked beyond composure, dropped his golden mace. He whispered a single word that even his scribes preserved: madness. But it was too late for commands, too late for formations, too late for reason. The tidal wave of Crusader steel was almost upon them. The first volley of Muslim arrows darkened the sky. Knights toppled. Horses screamed. Feathers and steel rained upon the charging line. Yet the formation did not falter. Those who fell were trampled by their own comrades, the charge swallowing them without slowing. The momentum was unstoppable. The ground itself trembled. Even the war horses, creatures nearly dead from exhaustion just an hour earlier, seemed possessed. barreling forward with unnatural strength. Later chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, agreed on this one point. The animals fought like they were driven by something beyond human command. As the distance closed to 200 yards, panic began rippling through Saladin's front ranks. The Templars were no ordinary knights. They were symbols. They were legends. Stories of their ferocity had spread across the Middle East for decades. And now, instead of cowering behind castle walls, they were coming straight at them. At 100 yards, horses in Saladin's line began backing away, ignoring their riders' spurs. Animals do not lie. They knew what was coming. At 50 yards, the air filled with screams in Arabic, French, and Latin, overlapping in a frenzy of terror and fury. Then came the collision. It was not a clash of men. It was an impact like the meeting of two worlds, an explosion of wood, iron, flesh, and sound. The Templar wedge punched into Saladin's still-forming center with the force of a battering ram. Lances shattered. Armor split. Horses were thrown into the air. 300 Mamluks died in the first seconds alone, crushed beneath hooves or impaled before they could raise shields. But the true horror came after the impact. Instead of wheeling away, instead of regrouping for a second charge, as any cavalry would normally do, the Templars continued pushing forward, driving deeper into the Muslim lines, like a dagger seeking the heart. Behind them came the second wave, 420 knights of Jerusalem, riding directly into the gap the Templars had opened. Muslim ranks folded inward, buckling under the pressure. 8,000 elite cavalry, the finest warriors of the Islamic world, found themselves being pushed backward by a force so small it defied comprehension. But the chaos did not end there. Baldwin had saved his most shocking move for the perfect moment. From a patch of dead ground, a depression unseen by Saladin's scouts, 3,000 Crusader infantry suddenly emerged, slamming into the Muslim flank with spears lowered. To Saladin's men, it seemed as if the Christians had risen from the earth itself. Shouts of "We are surrounded" spread like wildfire, even though the Crusaders numbered only a fraction of the Muslim army. Panic is rarely rational, and once it begins, it devours even the bravest soldiers. By 2:30 in the afternoon, the impossible was unfolding. 26,000 warriors, confident and relaxed only hours earlier, were now fighting for their lives. The cavalry on Saladin's left wing began to drift backward. At first it was only a few riders, then dozens, then hundreds, and once a retreat begins, even the smallest backward step becomes a flood. Saladin's center began to collapse under the relentless pressure of Baldwin's knights. Dust filled the air, blood drenched the soil. War cries and prayers twisted together until they became indistinguishable. And in the midst of all of it, Baldwin still rode. A dying boy who could barely feel his own limbs, guiding knights with gestures his body should not have been capable of making. Some said they saw blood leaking from beneath his silver mask. Others swore his voice never trembled once as he shouted commands. But they all agreed on one thing. Baldwin fought like a man who had nothing left to lose except his kingdom. Soon the battlefield began to tilt toward catastrophe, not for Baldwin, but for Saladin. The natural ravines behind the Muslim lines, invisible from a distance, now became fatal traps. As warriors tried to escape, they jammed into narrow gullies, piling upon one another. Horses broke legs. Men suffocated beneath their comrades. Cries filled the ravines, echoing like the wails of the damned. Baldwin had seen this terrain. Saladin had not, and that difference would shatter an empire. At 3 o'clock came the moment that stunned even the chroniclers of the age. Saladin's personal guard, 2,000 elite Mamluks who had sworn to die before abandoning their sultan, broke. These were men who had stood against Mongols and Turks, men who had survived sieges and marched across deserts. But against Baldwin's unrelenting charge, they fled. Their courage snapped not by numbers, but by fear. Fear that the Christians were not fighting as men, but as something beyond mortal. And then, in the most humiliating moment of his life, Saladin abandoned his horse, too slow to outrun the carnage, and mounted a racing camel, disappearing into the desert as his army dissolved behind him. It was the beginning of complete annihilation. The moment Saladin vanished over the ridge on the back of his racing camel, the battle ceased to be a contest of armies and became something far darker. Without their commander, without the unbroken will that had guided them through countless victories, the great host of Islam disintegrated. What had begun that morning as an ocean of steel now churned into a storm of terror. Warriors who had once ridden with pride now threw away shields and sabers in desperation. Horses collided, rolled, and crushed their riders. Men screamed in Arabic for their brothers, their imams, their lost leaders. But there was no sound on the field louder than the steady, relentless thunder of hooves behind them. The knights of Jerusalem were no longer soldiers. They were executioners. Fueled by the impossible victory unfolding around them, pushed forward by a king who should not have been alive, they chased fleeing Muslims with a fury that belonged to another world. Those with broken lances seized swords. Those with shattered swords tore maces from the dead. Some, when even their maces were ruined, beat their enemies to death with their iron helmets. Not once did they slow. Not once did they rest. For 2 hours, through dust, heat, blood, and choking smoke, they hunted Saladin's army across 3 miles of open plain. Even now, historians struggle to understand how 500 exhausted knights, men who had marched through the night and fought for hours under a brutal sun, found the strength to pursue a much larger force for so long. Christian chroniclers said God filled their limbs with divine fire. Muslim chroniclers, horrified and unable to explain what they were seeing, wrote that the battle was a punishment sent from heaven. Horses that should have collapsed ran with the speed of fresh war steeds. Knights who should have fainted from fatigue swung their weapons as if made of air. No scholar can account for it. But the field of Montchisard bears witness to what happened. The ravines behind Saladin's army now became death pits. Men poured into them by the hundreds, crushing each other in their desperation to escape. The narrow channels funneled them downward like living rivers, and once one man stumbled, the others fell on top of him. Soon the ravines were filled with layers of bodies, some dead, some dying, some still clawing toward daylight, only to be buried alive under those who fell after them. Knights rode along the edges of these ravines, stabbing downward at the mass of fleeing soldiers who could not escape. Blood streamed into the cracks of the earth. Dust turned to mud, mud turned to crimson paste, and the screams from these natural graves rose like a chorus of the damned. By mid-afternoon, the slaughter reached its peak. The sun, beginning its descent, lit the plain with a deep golden glow that made the dust look like smoke from burning incense. But nothing holy remained on that field. The smell of sweat, blood, and ruptured bodies drifted across the wind. Weapons lay scattered everywhere. Broken spears, snapped bows, curved scimitars dropped in panic. Banners once held high now lay trampled in the dirt, soaked in the blood of their bearers. And in the midst of this hell, Baldwin IV still fought. The king who could barely walk, who could not feel the fingers gripping his sword, who bled beneath his silver mask, continued to ride at the front of his knights. More than once he nearly collapsed, and Templars had to keep him upright in the saddle. They knew he should have been dead before the sun rose that morning. Yet somehow, impossibly, Baldwin remained conscious, shouting commands and rallying his men. Some knights swore they saw tears of blood leaking from beneath his mask. Others said the mask itself looked like the face of judgment come alive. Whether any of it is true hardly matters. What mattered was that his presence broke the last sliver of courage left in Saladin's army. At around 3:30 in the afternoon, the pursuit finally began to slow. Not because the knights willed it, but because their horses could go no farther. One by one, the mighty war horses collapsed from exhaustion. Their chests heaved, their legs buckled. Some simply fell where they stood, dying on the very field where they had carried their riders to immortality. The knights dismounted, panting, drenched in sweat and blood, surrounded by the ruins of an army once considered invincible. By 4 o'clock, the scope of the destruction became clear. The ravines were clogged with bodies stacked 20 feet deep. The plains were carpeted with the dead, so many that surviving knights had to pick their steps carefully to avoid tripping over corpses. In some places, the bodies lay so thick that even horses had refused to run through them, skidding instead across a carpet of limbs. Of the 26,000 warriors who had marched with Saladin that morning, fewer than 2,000 would ever see another sunrise. It was not a defeat. It was erasure. A single afternoon had undone a decade of Saladin's conquests. An army that should have taken Jerusalem with ease had been shattered by 500 men and a king the world believed already half dead. The chronicles of both faiths agree. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Nothing like it would happen again. As the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the field of Montgisard, the slaughter at last came to an end. The cries faded, the dust settled, and the knights of Jerusalem, covered head to toe in gore, finally gathered around their king. Baldwin, his strength spent, allowed them to lift him gently from his horse. His body sagged, limp and trembling, his bandaged hands dripping blood. Yet before he allowed anyone to tend his wounds, before he permitted his knights even a moment of rest, Baldwin ordered one final act. On that field of death, surrounded by 20,000 fallen enemies, the leper king knelt. One by one, every knight followed, sinking to their knees among the bodies, and together they prayed, Non nobis Domine. Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory. The words rose over a battlefield that moments earlier had echoed with screams. And as they finished their prayer, even hardened warriors wept, not out of grief, but at the realization that they had witnessed something no mortal should have seen. This was Montgisard. This was the day 500 men stood before an empire and did the impossible. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon and the long shadows of evening crawled across the blood-soaked plain, the enormity of what had happened finally came into focus. 20,000 Muslim warriors lay dead, corpses stretched for miles, forming a grisly tapestry of steel, torn banners, shattered shields, and stiffening flesh. The ravines were so tightly packed with bodies that the dead formed grotesque bridges across which surviving knights could walk. Horses wandered aimlessly among the fallen, whinnying in confusion, hooves tapping against discarded helmets and severed spears. Baldwin IV, barely conscious, was laid gently upon a cloak spread on the ground. The effort of battle had broken him more deeply than any wound. His hands bled through their bandages. His breathing rattled within his chest. His mask had begun to slip, revealing glimpses of ravaged skin beneath. The physicians who hurried to examine him whispered among themselves, certain the king would not live to see morning. Yet Baldwin, with a stubbornness that defied reason, waved them away. He summoned the remaining Templars and knights and ordered them to verify the battlefield. Not for tactical reasons, those were already clear, but out of the instinctive responsibility of a commander who wanted to know, with certainty, that his people had survived this day. Only after receiving reassurance did the king finally allow himself to recline against a saddle set upright behind him. But the work was not done. The Crusaders now stood before wealth beyond anything they had imagined. Saladin had marched north, preparing for the complete conquest of the kingdom. His army carried with it supplies for a prolonged campaign: grain, weaponry, fletching tools, armor, medical equipment, tents, and, most importantly, the war chest. Chests of gold and silver coins had traveled with the Sultan to pay his soldiers and purchase loyalty. Now all of it lay abandoned, scattered across the plains or inside overturned wagons. The Templars moved methodically through the wreckage, gathering weapons and armor equal to outfitting entire fortresses. They found thousands of unspent arrows, bundles of fine Arabian saddles, stacks of shields engraved with Quranic calligraphy, and enough blades to equip entire garrisons. They uncovered horses of rare breeds, fine desert stallions worth fortunes in Europe, and at the center of it all, they discovered Saladin's personal treasure, enough gold to fund the Crusader kingdom for years. Jerusalem had been nearly bankrupt. That morning, the kingdom's coffers had held so little that some believed they could not sustain another campaign. But now, in less than 3 hours, through a battle won against all arithmetic and expectation, Jerusalem had become wealthy again. It was a reversal so staggering that even the most pragmatic warriors whispered that God's hand had been at work. But if the Crusaders felt awe, the Muslim world felt devastation. Saladin, still escaping under the cover of twilight, arrived at the outskirts of safety with only a handful of bodyguards left. The rest had scattered or died. His camel heaved beneath him, exhausted from the frantic run. When he finally dismounted, trembling and drenched in sweat, he faced the unthinkable. He had suffered the greatest defeat of his life. His invincible reputation, carefully built over a decade of victories, had shattered in a single afternoon. Word spread quickly across Syria and Egypt, first as rumors, then as panicked reports, then as grim fact. The greatest Muslim army assembled in a generation had been nearly annihilated. Emirs began questioning his judgment. Commanders argued over whether he had acted rashly. Some murmured that the Sultan had been forsaken by God. And worst of all, the common people lost confidence. Confidence that had been the foundation of Saladin's power. The chronicler Ibn al-Athir, normally sympathetic to Islamic causes, wrote that it was the most terrible catastrophe to befall Islam in this age. Another anonymous scribe recorded simply, "God turned his face from us that day." Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, celebrations erupted. Church bells rang without pause. Priests led processions through the streets. People wept, embracing strangers in the alleys. Women kissed the hands of knights returning from the battlefield, many still covered in blood. It was as if the entire city had come back from the dead. But in the private chamber of the palace, where heavy tapestries muffled the distant noise of celebration, the leper king lay still, pale as ivory. The battle had drained him in ways no one could see. His body, ravaged by disease, could no longer hide its deterioration. Physicians whispered grim predictions. His fever was rising, his wounds had reopened, and he might not survive the night. Yet somehow, impossibly, he lived. When dawn's first light slipped through the window, Baldwin awoke. His breathing was shallow but steady. He ordered a report on the kingdom's status. He asked for updates on the captured supplies. He requested the names of knights who had died at Montgisard so their families could be honored. Every word was spoken through a throat thick with pain, but his mind, always sharp, always unbroken, remained untouched. The victory at Montgisard had bought Jerusalem 10 more years of life, 10 years to rebuild, regroup, and resist the rising power of Saladin. 10 years to prepare for the next storm. But it also transformed the reputation of its dying king. Throughout the Muslim world, Saladin himself admitted, "I feared that boy more than any army." And across Europe, the tale spread like wildfire. A leper who fought like a lion. A child king who led men into the jaws of death and emerged triumphant. But victory always carries a cost. Baldwin had spent more than strength on the battlefield. He had spent pieces of his remaining life. And though he would reign for 8 more years, each one was marked by increasing pain, darkness, and physical decline. By the time he drew his final breath at age 24, he was blind, unable to walk, wrapped in bandages, but still a king in spirit. Montgisard had been his greatest hour, the moment when a dying teenager held back the tide of history. And as the years passed, people would ask the question that has echoed through centuries. Did Baldwin win because of divine intervention, or because of the courage he inspired? Did 500 knights triumph because they believed in God, or because they believed in their king? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Perhaps the truth is that sometimes, once in a generation, a moment appears in which human will pushes beyond human limits. A moment when numbers no longer decide outcomes. A moment when faith, fearlessness, and desperation merge into something invincible. That moment was Montgisard. In the years that followed Montgisard, the Holy Land lived in a strange, improbable calm, like a wounded lion resting after a brutal fight, battered yet still alive. The victory had stunned the world. The Crusader states, once thought moments from collapse, were given time they never should have possessed. Their enemies retreated in shock. Their allies, astonished, whispered that Jerusalem had been granted a miracle. But miracles are not permanent. And the boy who had delivered this one was fading like a candle burning itself to nothing. Baldwin the Dwarf ruled on, year after year, defying every prediction of his impending death. Each dawn seemed a miracle of its own. His hands curled tighter with every passing month. His eyesight clouded. His voice grew weaker. But his mind, sharp, disciplined, fierce, remained untouched by the disease that consumed his flesh. The pain was constant, gnawing at him like a shadow with teeth. Yet he continued to lead, never once allowing pity to dictate policy. Foreign ambassadors marveled at him. Generals swore loyalty to him with genuine reverence. Chroniclers scribbled by candlelight, trying to capture how a man whose body was failing so completely could possess a spirit so indomitable. Even Saladin, the Sultan humbled at Montgisard, admitted that the leper king had altered his understanding of leadership. "I feared that boy more than any army," he is said to have remarked, and in those words was the weight of truth. For a general can face armies. He can predict strategies and counter them. But how does one fight a king who has already conquered death in his own life? Yet the shadow of Montgisard loomed over both realms. Baldwin knew the victory had not ended the threat. It had only delayed the inevitable. Saladin was not a man to accept humiliation quietly. Though shaken, though questioned by his emirs, he slowly rebuilt. Every year, new warriors joined his ranks. Every season brought fresh levies from Egypt and Syria. His coffers overflowed, his alliances strengthened. The Muslim world recovered its confidence, not quickly, but steadily, and Baldwin watched all of it with an awareness sharpened by the knowledge that he would not live to face the storm he had delayed. Within Jerusalem, political tensions rose. Factions formed and sharpened their knives, knowing the king's time was running out. They debated who would succeed him. They schemed to control the regency. They whispered about marriage alliances, inheritances, and bloodlines. Baldwin, though weakening, tried to hold these competing ambitions together with the last remnants of his authority. He issued decrees. He mediated disputes. He summoned lords who disobeyed him and confronted them with the unwavering force of his mind. If not his body,